Hello, welcome to the Mark Jones Photography YouTube channel. Today I'm going to walk you through my process for editing another photo. I took this a couple of years ago, one of my favorite photos, and I shot this on a Nikon D50-500, and I was at 18 millimeters, and I had a very high contrast scene. As you can tell, we have some very dark areas and the sun, which is our brightest point. So one of the things that I thought about when I first came upon this scene is that it was going to be difficult to capture this in one shot. So I went into it knowing that I'm going to need to capture a darker exposure so that I can get more control over the sun over here, and a much lighter exposure so I can get control of this area of the boat without creating a lot of noise in the image. Because as it stands right now, if I go to the develop module and I bring down my highlights and then bring up my shadows, and if we take a look in here, I don't have as much control of the sun as I would like. It's still kind of a big fireball out there. And if I come close into the boat here, I'll see that I have quite a bit of noise as a result of bringing up the shadows. So what I want is more information in the photo. So I took this darker exposure here that will allow me to get a little more control over the sun. And then I took this much brighter exposure here so that I can bring information out of the darker parts of the image without creating quite so much noise. So I'm going to go ahead and merge these now. So I'm going to grab the light exposure, the dark exposure, and the middle exposure. And Lightroom has a really nice feature where you can merge all these together into an HDR file. Now, HDR kind of has a bad reputation. When it first came out and people were using it a lot, they would create these really cartoonish looking images using tone mapping. That's not what I do with my HDR images. I used to when it first came out, but I don't do that anymore. I'm really interested in trying to make it look very realistic. So when I take these three images and grab them back again, and I edit them, I go to Photo Merge and HDR, and Lightroom will just bring these all together and auto align them for me. I have it checked right up here to auto align, and there we go. There's the photo. So I never click auto settings because that will try to apply toning to the image, and I want it as basic as possible so that I have maximum control over what the image is going to look like. That's one of the things I love about shooting raw, is that I'm going to get a very basic looking flat image, and I'm allowed to edit it any way I want, and it's going to be very unique. No one else is going to wind up with the exact same photograph that I have, because I'm starting from this. It's like starting from a blank canvas, and I just apply all the edits that I want to, and it's going to be uniquely mine. So I'm going to hit merge, and you'll see Lightroom thinking up here, and it's going to create a raw file, which is nice. So I'm going to have a file with all the information of those three exposures, and it's right here, and you can see it's a DNG file, which is a raw file. And now I'm ready to start editing this image. So the first thing I'm going to do here is bring down the highlights, and I'm looking at that sun, and let's bring it to about there, maybe up a little bit more. So that, if you think back to that first image, you see how blown out it was there, and even when I brought the highlights all the way down, it still looks like a big fireball out there. Now we come to the image that I edited, and that looks much more manageable. And the next thing I'm going to do is bring up the shadows, and I usually don't just bring it all the way up and I'm done. I bring it up until it looks the way I want it to look. So I'm looking at the image, I'm looking at the dark parts, and I do want it to be dark, but I don't want it to be so dark that you don't see a little bit of detail in there. If you look over here, you have this section here with these little rivets in the boat. I do want to be able to see all this section around here very clearly. So after I bring down my highlights and bring down my highlights and bring up the shadows, I'm going to set my white point and my black point. So this is basically setting the lightest part of the image, what's going to be white, and what I do is bring it up to where I just start to see the white, and then I bring it right back down just above it. There we go. And for those of you who are new at Lightroom, if you just click the Option key and then click the whites or the blacks, that's how you get that screen that will allow you to tell where the really bright parts are, and here we go, here's the really dark parts. So this is showing me what areas of the image are absolutely black. So I will typically crush the blacks in some of my photos. We don't want to go too far so that that area that I want to bring out is completely gone, but I'm going to bring it down just about that much. So we have something that's absolutely white or close to it in the image and something that's absolutely black. I like to have that wide dynamic range in all my photographs. I find that when I print them, it just looks better, and I'm just much more satisfied with the way they come out. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is add a little contrast in my midtones because it still looks a little washed out in here. There's a couple different ways you can do this. I mean, you can just go and hit the contrast slider and that fixes it right up in there. It looks pretty good. I personally like to have a little bit more control about where that's being applied, so I typically go to the tone curve, and I'm looking right about here in the midtones, and I'm going to bring that down just a little bit more, and then I'm going to bring this section of the midtone up. There we go. And that's enough for me right there. So we can go back and forth and take a look at the way it looked before and now the way it looks. It's subtle, but that's what I want, rather than just bringing up the contrast slider and allowing it to put it where it thinks it should go. So already this is looking pretty good. So if I go back to the original image and now I go to the edits that I make, it's starting to look pretty good. So after I've made my adjustments in the basic panel, I like to adjust my the overall temperature of the shot. I actually kind of like where this is coming out right now. I like this cool area and this warmer area over here. I'm going to actually bring it overall just a little warmer. There we go. That looks pretty good. I really like that right there. So I'm going to leave the actual basic panel alone for the moment. Those are my basic edits, and really we could say that we're done here. But I want to add some other things to this. So I'm going to go down here to the color section, and I can either bring the vibrance up to add a little more emphasis to specific colors, or I could use the let me reset this, or I could use the saturation slider. If you don't know about the difference between the two of those, just real quick, the vibrance slider is going to emphasize parts of the image that are basically de-emphasized in the photo. So it's not going to bring up all the colors evenly. It's going to basically bring up the colors that are less emphasized in the photo, whereas the saturation slider is going to bring up all of the colors together. And that's rarely what I'm looking for. I use the vibrance slider almost all the time and rarely touch the saturation slider. So I'm just going to bring it up about that much to add a little bit more punch to the colors. And I'm pretty much done in the color area. The next thing I'm going to do, and actually I probably should have done this at the beginning, was I go to my lens corrections and I do click remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And when I did that, you could see an adjustment to the photo. I'll go back and you'll see that's the way it looks without the profile corrections, and check it and it adjusts it, and it looks better. Because what Lightroom does is it takes into account the type of lens that you're using with the camera, and it corrects the distortion that you get with these lenses. So that looks much better. And typically I do that right at the beginning, but for some reason I didn't this time. So already it's looking pretty good. And again, we could leave it as is and say this is done. But there's some other things I want to do to kind of dress this up a bit. The boat is the subject. So I want to bring a little bit more emphasis to the boat. So what I'm going to do is grab an adjustment brush, and I'm going to reset by hitting clicking on the effect button, and that resets all of these. And I'm going to bring up the clarity a little bit. And the clarity, basically we add a type of mid-tone contrast to the adjustments that I'm going to make here. And it makes the image just stand out, or the section that I'm going to edit is going to make it kind of stand out a little more. It'll get a little darker too, but I can adjust that as we go on. But it'll have a little more crispness to it. So if I bring it a little bigger here, and by the way, I also have to take a look at my auto mask here. If I'm going to be, auto mask basically will prevent me from, well, coloring over the lines. So as I'm making my adjustments here, I can make it right along the area I want to. But when I get to this area in here, I actually turn off the auto mask. I want my densities set all the way up. I like to have it fairly feathered, so it's not applying it with hard corners. It's very soft edges. And I'm going to keep my flow all the way up because once I apply the adjustment, I don't want to have to go over it again in this particular case. So the flow, if I had it way down, it would apply it gently, and then I could apply it again, and it would get more emphasis on the adjustment. But I want the adjustment in its full strength right away. You can also click Show Selected Mask so that when you begin making the adjustments, you can actually see in red where the adjustments are that you're making. So I'm just grabbing all inside the boat here, and I'm doing this quickly because just for the sake of the video. But what I would typically do here on the edges is hit Auto Mask and then start to go around it, which will help me to stay inside the lines there. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Now here, if I didn't want to bring any emphasis to this part of the image, I can just go back here and erase. Hit the erase button and bring it up a little bit, and let's erase. See, it gets rid of that. And that way we're only adjusting the inside of the image and the corner of the boat there. Okay, so go back to A. So I've made these adjustments in here. Let's add some over on this side. And I actually am going to go in and bring it into the rope area as well to bring some emphasis to that. Okay. That looks pretty good. However, I'll see how this looks in a minute here. I'm going to bring some emphasis to this side of the boat as well. It may be too much. If it is, I'll just get rid of it. All right. So, and I also want to go down this side of the boat as well. I may end up creating another brush if this ends up not looking the greatest, what I did down there. So now we can uncheck that, and now we can go ahead and make our edit to just that section. Now you can already see the boat looks a little bit different because I made the clarity adjustment. Let's bring it down. See how much more dull it looks? And then I bring up that clarity slider, and it adds just a little more crispness to it. And that looks really good. I'm going to warm it up a little bit because it did lose a little bit of that golden color on there. But that looks wonderful. That's exactly what I was looking for. So let's, again, I like to go back to the beginning. That's what I started off with, and that's what I have now. This is one of my favorite things about being a photographer, is this post-processing phase, because you're taking this very dull image and you're creating your own masterpiece with it. It's really quite gratifying to do the post-processing phase, as opposed to just shooting a JPEG and letting the camera do the processing for you. So anyway, I've made my adjustments here, and I think I'm pretty good to go. I'm going to hit done here. I am going to straighten the horizon a bit. Another thing I usually do at the beginning, but just a hair, I'm going to adjust that. You know, it really wasn't that bad. It just kind of looked a little off to me. And nope, still looks off to me. Let's bring it over here. No, we're talking just tiny amount there. I'm using the lines that are trying to line it up. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to do is use a graduated filter, and I'm going to make some adjustments to the sky. So what's bothering me there is it's too bright still. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Oh, that's great. Adds a little atmosphere to it. That looks really good. And then I'm going to, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit new. I want the blue over here to stand out. I think it creates a nice color contrast to the warmth that we have on the other side. So let's do this. And the thing about your graduated filter, you can see where it's being applied. Yes, it's sort of spilling a little bit over into the boat, but I don't mind that so much. It's going to be very, very little, and to me, you might have a little bit of reflection of that coming off the sky anyway. So that part doesn't bother me. But you can see up here that the majority of this sky on this side is what's going to get the change that I'm going to make. So now that I've got that graduated filter in place, I'm going to cool it off a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Just that section, and we're talking tiny amounts. So here's without that. Oops. And then I'm just gonna add, too much, just a tiny amount. Yeah, so it's really subtle. So that's without it, and that's with it. So I kind of like that. It's just me. I think it looks pretty good. And I'm pretty much done with this image now. So this is one way to edit this particular photograph. If this is how I originally edited it when I shot it a few years ago, and I think it works just fine. I've actually moved to some different types of exposure blending that I think in some ways work better, but I'll save that for another video. But this does really well. And there's one other thing I'm seeing as I'm looking at it here. This area here needs more contrast. It's actually kind of bothering me. Sometimes I actually get away from the photograph for a couple hours or even a couple days, and then I come back to it and scan it over and look at it and see if anything jumps out that actually bothers me. But this is bothering me right now, so I'm going to grab another adjustment brush. I'm going to zero it out there, and I'm going to use the contrast slider, and I'm going to add just a little bit of contrast. Let me make sure the mask is off. Add a little bit of contrast to that area because it did look flat to me. I know it's getting darker here, darker than I want, but that's okay. I can correct it. I actually like to bring it on heavy sometimes and then back off of it. So this is that area before I did the edit, and then I'm going to just bring it down a little bit, add a little contrast, and hit done. And now it looks pretty good to me. The one thing that I may do in post, actually I did do this at one point to this image, is I got rid of these this foliage bleeding over into the image. I just took that out in Photoshop. It took a little bit of time, but it was worth it, and that was actually the version that I ended up printing and hanging on the wall. So this is my edit to this, and if you have any questions, comments, leave them below. If you thought this was useful, give my channel a like, and I will see you on the next video.